December 8th, 1941. 200 miles west of Pearl Harbor, the USS Enterprise cut through Pacific waters under a sky that seemed to hold its breath. The carrier's massive flight deck, nearly 900 feet of wood and steel, glistened with morning condensation. Salt spray caught the first light of dawn, creating halos around the island superstructure, where Admiral William Frederick Halsey Jr. stood motionless, his jaw clenched so tight his officers could see the muscles working beneath weathered skin. Behind them, Pearl Harbor still burned. The carrier had been spared by weather and fortune. A storm system had delayed Enterprise's return from Wake Island, pushing her arrival at Pearl Harbor from December 6th to what should have been the morning of the 7th. That delay had saved her. While Arizona exploded and Oklahoma capsized and 2,403 Americans died in fire and water, Enterprise steamed through empty ocean, oblivious. Her air group had arrived during the attack itself. 18 SBD, Dauntless dive bombers, flying ahead to scout the carrier's approach to Pearl Harbor, had descended into hell. 7 were shot from the sky by their own countrymen or torn apart by Japanese Zeros. The pilots who survived landed at Ford Island or Oa Field with bullet holes in their wings and stories that sounded like fever dreams. The radio transmission had come at 0812 hours. Air raid Pearl Harbor. This is no drill. Those 7 words ended one world and began another. The officers on Enterprise's bridge had stared at the message board in silence. Someone dropped a coffee cup. The sound of shattering porcelain echoed in the sudden quiet. Then Halsey's voice, barely above a whisper, but carrying the weight of fury that would define the Pacific War. Every goddamn Jap in the ocean is now a target. On the evening of December 8th, Enterprise entered Pearl Harbor. What her crew witnessed destroyed language itself. How do you describe battleships lying on their sides like murdered whales? How do you capture the smell of fuel oil mixed with burned flesh that hung over the water like a shroud? The harbour was a graveyard pretending to be a port. Men still pulled bodies from the wreckage. Arizona rested on the bottom, her superstructure a twisted skeleton reaching toward a sky that had failed to protect her. Oklahoma's hull rose from the water like a tombstone. The mathematical reality was crushing. 8 battleships damaged or destroyed, 188 aircraft obliterated. The Pacific Fleet gutted in 110 minutes. Halsey walked the deck that night, alone, staring at the burning ships. He was 59 years old, a destroyer veteran from the First World War. A man who understood that navies were built from courage and steel in equal measure. Around him, his crew worked in silence. They refueled Enterprise in 7 hours, a task that normally required 24. They loaded bombs and torpedoes with hands that shook from exhaustion and rage. They checked engines and patched damage and calibrated instruments while Pearl Harbor's fires painted their faces orange. No one spoke about what they'd seen. There were no words adequate to the moment. By dawn on December 9th, Enterprise was ready for sea again. Her escorts formed up around her. Heavy cruisers Northampton, Chester and Salt Lake City, their 8-inch gun turrets training restlessly across empty horizons. 9 destroyers of Destroyer Squadron 6 took positions in the screen, their sonar operators already hunched over primitive detection equipment, listening for sounds that meant death. Task Force 8 turned northeast, away from the burning harbour toward waters that every man aboard knew contained Japanese submarines. The mathematics were simple and terrible. 27 I-class submarines had deployed to Hawaiian waters in support of the Pearl Harbor attack. These were the largest submarines in the world, over 300 feet of steel housing, 93 men and enough torpedoes to sink a fleet. They were hunting American carriers, and Enterprise was steaming directly into their patrol lines. The destroyers heard it first, not with their ears, but with technology that felt like magic wrapped in physics, sonar. The Navy called it QC, the British called it ASDIC, but to the sailors wearing headphones in darkened compartments, it was simply the sound of survival. They sent pulses of sound into the ocean and listened for echoes. Every whale became a potential contact. Every thermal layer that bent sound waves created ghosts on the screens. Every school of fish triggered investigations that consumed hours and fuel and nerve. On December 9th, USS Balch made contact. Something was out there, bearing 035 degrees, range 4,000 yards. The sonar operator, a 22-year-old from Michigan who had joined the Navy to see the world, heard a rhythm that wasn't biological, machinery, propellers, the deliberate sounds of something built to kill, moving through water with purpose. Balch's captain ordered flank speed. The destroyer surged forward, black smoke pouring from her stacks, bow wave climbing white and angry. At 28 knots, she raced toward the contact's last known position. But here was the cruel paradox of submarine warfare. To detect, you must move slowly. To attack, you must move fast. And when you move fast, you become deaf to everything except your own thunder. The depth charges rolled off Balch's stern in sequence. 10 steel drums filled with 300 pounds of explosive each. They sank at 10 feet per second, predictable as mathematics, deadly as prayer. At 100 feet, the first charges detonated. The ocean erupted in geysers 50 feet high. Underwater, pressure waves radiated outward at the speed of sound, creating forces that could crush steel hulls like aluminum cans. If a submarine was within 50 feet of a detonation, it died. If it was within 100 feet, it bled. But sonar heard nothing afterward except the ocean's ambiguous whispers. The contact had vanished. Whether Balch had killed a submarine, wounded one that crawled away to die, or simply thrown explosives at shadows would never be known with certainty. This was the brutal uncertainty of anti-submarine warfare. Most attacks ended in question marks. Most victories went unconfirmed. Submarines died in silence, taking their crews into depths where light never reached and pressure crushed evidence into unrecognizable debris. The destroyers continued their patrol. Enterprise launched aircraft at dawn on December 10th. SBD Dauntless dive bombers spreading across the ocean in search patterns calculated to cover every probable submarine position. The pilots flew at 3,000 feet, high enough to see for miles, low enough to spot periscopes or the subtle feather of wake that betrayed a submarine at shallow depth. Each aircraft carried a single bomb, 1,000 pounds of high explosive that would either sink a submarine or waste itself in empty water. They had been at war for 3 days. Already, the rules were changing. The Japanese submarine I-70 had been built in 1935 at the Kawasaki shipyard in Kobe. She displaced 1,285 tons when submerged, stretched over 300 feet from bow to stern, and dove to depths that Allied submarines of the era could only dream about reaching. Her diesel engines could push her at 20 knots on the surface. Her electric motors gave her 8 knots submerged, enough for positioning, but not pursuit. She carried 17 torpedoes, each one capable of ripping a cruiser in half. Her deck mounted a 120mm gun for surface engagements and a 13mm machine gun for air defence, though both were almost pathetically inadequate against aircraft. 93 men called her home. They lived in spaces so cramped that bunks were shared in rotation, slept while breathing air recycled through scrubbers that removed carbon dioxide, but left the atmosphere tasting of diesel and sweat and fear. They were experienced sailors. Many had served in operations off China. Some had participated in the Pearl Harbor attack, though I-70 herself had not carried one of the midget submarines that attempted to penetrate the harbour. Her mission was simpler and more brutal. Patrol northwest of Oahu, remain hidden, report fleet movements, and kill anything that flew the American flag. On the morning of December 10th, I-70 surfaced to run her diesels and recharge batteries depleted by hours of submerged patrol. This was standard procedure, dictated by technology that couldn't yet keep submarines underwater indefinitely. Every submarine of the era faced the same vulnerability. They were surface ships that could dive, not true submarines in the modern sense. They needed air for their diesels, air for their crews, time on the surface to maintain the electrical systems that made submerged operations possible. The location was approximately 200 miles northeast of Oahu, far enough from Pearl Harbor that American patrols were thought unlikely, close enough to intercept any carrier task force attempting to sortie. The morning was calm, visibility unlimited, the kind of day that submarine commanders both loved and feared. Perfect conditions for spotting enemy ships. Perfect conditions for being spotted. At 600 hours, Ensign Teaff, flying an SBD Dauntless from Scouting Squadron 6, spotted I-70 on the surface at approximately 23 degrees, 45 minutes north, 150 degrees 35 minutes west. The submarine was 15 miles away when Teaff first saw her, a dark shape against lighter water, wake spreading behind her like accusation. He climbed to gain altitude for an attack dive, his radio man in the rear seat already calling in the contact to Enterprise. Below him, I-70's lookouts spotted the approaching aircraft. Alarm bells rang through the submarine. The deck gun crew abandoned their weapon. Hatches slammed shut. Ballast tanks vented, air rushing out in geyser blasts as seawater flooded in, increasing the submarine's weight, dragging her down. But submarines dove slowly. 50 feet per minute was good performance. 100 feet per minute was exceptional. From the surface to safe depth, where bombs couldn't reach, required 2 to 3 minutes of agonizing vulnerability. And Teaff was already diving, his SBD screaming down from 5,000 feet at speeds approaching 300 miles per hour. The dive bomber fell like judgment itself. Teaff centered I-70 in his telescopic sight, watching her grow larger through the optical tube that turned bombing into something approaching precision. At 800 feet, he pulled the release lever. 1,000 pounds of high explosive separated from the aircraft, following a ballistic arc calculated by gravity and forward momentum. The bomb struck water 50 feet aft of I-70's conning tower. It was not a direct hit. In the ruthless mathematics of submarine warfare, it didn't need to be. The explosion propagated through water as a shockwave travelling at 5,000 feet per second. Far faster than sound moved through air. This pressure wave struck I-70's hull with the force of a giant's hammer. Steel plates designed to resist external pressure from diving flexed inward, absorbing energy they were never meant to contain. Seams cracked, welds failed. Equipment tore loose from mountings and became shrapnel inside the pressure hull. Inside the submarine, men experienced trauma that defied description. The shockwave transmitted through steel and water and air simultaneously, hitting bodies with enough force to rupture internal organs. Those nearest the impact point were killed instantly, their nervous systems shut down by pressure that exceeded human tolerances. Others were stunned, deafened, injured by flying equipment or collapsing structures. Water began flooding into damaged compartments, through cracks and failures too numerous to plug. The submarine's captain faced calculations that offered only death in different forms. Remain submerged with flooding compartments, and I-70 would sink beyond crush depth, her hull imploding at approximately 900 feet, killing everyone aboard in microseconds. Surface and face, air attack without ability to maneuver or properly fight back. The choice wasn't survival or death, it was how to die, and whether to take the enemy with you. I-70 surfaced 10 minutes after the first attack. She wallowed in the swells, riding lower than submarines should ride, water streaming from damaged hull plates, oil spreading behind her in a slick that marked her path like blood. Crew members emerged from the conning tower hatch, some attempting to man the deck gun, others simply seeking air and light, in what they knew might be their final moments above water. The submarine's radio operator, if he survived the first attack, had perhaps 90 seconds to transmit a final message to Japanese command. Enemy carrier aircraft, approximate position, engaging, contact lost. Most likely, no such message was ever sent. Radio equipment was delicate. Shock waves destroyed vacuum tubes and shorted electrical systems. The antenna might have been damaged, or perhaps there simply wasn't time, in the chaos of flooding and casualties and dying machinery, to compose final words. Lieutenant Junior Grade Clarence E. Dickinson arrived several hours later in the early afternoon. He had been flying a separate search pattern when word came through of Teaff's attack, another submarine contact, damaged, struggling to stay afloat. He climbed to attack altitude, 5,000 feet, high enough that the dive would build terminal velocity, low enough that he wouldn't waste fuel or time. Below him, I-70 was dying slowly. The submarine had managed to maintain surface stability after the first attack, but she was mortally wounded. Flooding continued in damaged compartments. Power systems were failing. The crew had abandoned any pretense of combat effectiveness and was simply trying to keep their boat afloat long enough for rescue that every man aboard knew would never come. Japanese submarines in the area couldn't risk surfacing with American aircraft overhead. I-70's crew would survive or die based on their own efforts, alone in hostile waters, 200 miles from friendly territory. Dickinson rolled inverted and pulled through into his dive. The SBD accelerated rapidly, its fixed landing gear creating drag that actually helped control speed during the near vertical descent. Through his telescopic sight, I-70 filled the view, growing larger with each second. Some crew members on deck fired rifles at the approaching bomber. Others simply watched, too exhausted or too resigned to fight anymore. The submarine's 13mm machine gun tried to track the dive bomber, but couldn't elevate high enough to engage a target coming down at such steep angles. At 2,000 feet, Dickinson released his bomb. The 1,000-pound weapon fell for less than 3 seconds. It struck the water alongside I-70's hull amidships, the explosion creating a pressure wave and shrapnel storm that no surface vessel could survive. The blast effect was catastrophic. Hull plates ruptured. Internal bulkheads collapsed. The submarine lost all remaining watertight integrity simultaneously. Sailors on deck were blown overboard or killed by the concussion. The conning tower took structural damage. Most critically, the explosion destroyed what little buoyancy I-70 had maintained. The submarine's bow rose as water flooded aft compartments. For 45 seconds, I-70 stood nearly vertical, her stern already submerged 300 feet below the surface, her bow pointing at the sky like a monument to engineering defeated by physics. Men still trapped inside had perhaps 10 seconds of consciousness as the submarine slid backward into the Pacific. At depth, as pressure increased beyond tolerances, the hull imploded. The sound was audible on the surface, a deep resonant crump that marked the moment steel surrendered to ocean, then nothing except silence and spreading oil. I-70 settled toward the ocean floor 15,000 feet below. The descent would take nearly an hour. At that depth, pressure exceeded 2,000 tons per square inch. The submarine's hull, already compromised by explosions and flooding, collapsed completely. What reached the bottom was barely recognizable as a vessel that had once carried 93 men and the hopes of an empire. Dickinson circled once, confirming the kill. Oil spread across the surface in a widening circle. Debris floated in the slick. Pieces of wood, fabric, papers, and there were survivors, 4 men according to Japanese records, swimming weakly or clinging to wreckage. They were 200 miles from land in water that would cause hypothermia over time. No ships would come for them. No submarines could surface to search. The mathematics were brutal and final. Japanese naval records would list all 93 crew members as lost. The time was approximately 30 hours, early afternoon, on December 10th, 1941. I-70 had been the first major Japanese warship sunk by American forces after the declaration of war. The destroyer Ward had technically drawn first blood with her sinking of a midget submarine before Pearl Harbor, but that had been before war was official. This was different. This was deliberate, calculated, the beginning of a pattern that would repeat thousands of times across the Pacific. News reached Enterprise within minutes. The SBD pilots landed with gun camera footage and verbal reports that required no embellishment. Admiral Halsey's response was immediate. "Well done, that's one." The words carried weight beyond their simplicity. One submarine from a fleet of hundreds, one small victory in a war that had begun with devastating defeat. But it was proof that American forces could find the enemy, could strike back, could win. The psychological impact on Enterprise's crew exceeded any tactical significance. These men had witnessed Pearl Harbor's devastation just 2 days earlier. They had seen their fleet crippled, their shipmates killed, their nation's power seemingly broken in a single morning. Japanese forces appeared unstoppable, their planning perfect, their execution flawless, their warriors superior. And now, 3 days later, American pilots had hunted down a Japanese submarine and sent it to the bottom with 93 men aboard. The mathematics of war were beginning to reveal themselves. Not the mathematics of tactics or courage, where both sides possessed abundance, but the mathematics of industrial capacity and technical adaptation. The SBD Dauntless, that ungainly dive bomber with fixed landing gear and greenhouse canopy, had proven itself capable of precision attacks against the most difficult targets imaginable. Submarines that could submerge, maneuver in 3 dimensions and present minimal target profiles. The 1,000-pound bombs had demonstrated killing power that exceeded Japanese expectations. The coordination between carrier, aircraft and scouts had worked exactly as doctrine predicted. But more significantly, the sinking demonstrated something that would prove decisive across 4 years of Pacific warfare. American forces could learn, adapt and innovate faster than their enemies. 3 days after Pearl Harbor, they were already hunting submarines with modified tactics and improved coordination. Within weeks, they would be striking Japanese bases throughout the Central Pacific. Within months, they would turn the tide at Midway and Guadalcanal. The pattern established on December 10th would repeat until one side had been completely destroyed. The Imperial Japanese Navy's submarine force had entered the war with confidence bordering on arrogance. Their doctrine assumed submarine attacks on enemy warships would whittle down the American Pacific Fleet as it sailed westward toward the Philippines, weakening it before the decisive surface battle that Japanese strategists believed would determine the war's outcome. This focus on fleet operations, rather than commerce raiding, would prove a catastrophic strategic error, but in December 1941 it seemed logical, even brilliant. The submarines themselves were magnificent machines. I-class boats could dive to 300 feet, travel 16,000 miles without refueling, and carry enough torpedoes to sink a task force. Their crews were experienced, well-trained, dedicated. They operated under a warrior code that valued honor and sacrifice above survival. They would fight to the death, rather than surrender. They would accept suicide missions without hesitation. They possessed everything except the industrial base to replace losses and the strategic doctrine to employ their capabilities effectively. American submarines, by contrast, would ultimately focus on commerce raiding, strangling Japan's economy by sinking merchant ships that carried oil, food, and raw materials from conquered territories back to the home islands. This strategic choice, combined with American industrial capacity to build submarines faster than Japan could sink them, would prove decisive. But that victory lay years in the future. On December 10th, 1941, the submarine war was just beginning, and its eventual outcome remained uncertain. The destruction of I-70 marked the beginning of a pattern that would define the Pacific War. Japanese forces would win tactical victories through superior training, experience, and warrior spirit. American forces would win strategic victories through industrial capacity, technical innovation, and the ability to replace losses faster than enemies could inflict them. It was the mathematics of production versus the philosophy of Bushido, assembly lines versus honor codes, logistics versus courage. Neither side possessed monopoly on bravery. Japanese sailors would fight with fanatical determination, choosing death over surrender in proportions that shocked American forces. American sailors would display equal courage in different forms, enduring months of submarine patrols, accepting casualties that exceeded 50% in some air squadrons, continuing attacks despite horrific losses. The difference wasn't valor. The difference was capacity. American shipyards would produce submarines faster than Japan could sink them. American factories would build aircraft in quantities that seemed impossible to enemies who visited those factories as prisoners and witnessed production lines stretching beyond horizon. American training programs would graduate 30,000 pilots annually, while Japanese programs struggled to replace losses. The industrial base that seemed irrelevant in an era of warrior mystique would prove to be the only factor that mattered in total war. Enterprise would survive the entire war despite being reported sunk by Japanese propaganda multiple times. She would earn 20 battle stars, more than any American warship. She would participate in every major action in the Pacific: the Marshall Raids, the Doolittle Mission, Midway, Guadalcanal, the Philippine Sea, Leyte Gulf. She would be hit by bombs and kamikazes, but her rugged construction and excellent damage control would save her. After the war, she would transport thousands of servicemen home before being decommissioned in 1947. The 93 men of I-70 remain at their stations 15,000 feet below the Pacific surface. Their names are recorded in Japanese naval archives, memorialized at shrines honoring the war dead, remembered by families who never received bodies to bury. They went to war believing in their nation's superiority and their navy's invincibility. They died 3 days after their greatest victory, killed by an enemy they had been taught to despise as weak and undisciplined. The ocean floor where I-70 rests is darkness absolute, pressure that crushes steel like paper, cold that stops all biological process. The submarine's hull has collapsed under forces no engineering can resist. But somewhere in that wreckage, in compartments still sealed by chance or physics, evidence remains of the men who served aboard her. Personal effects, letters never sent, photographs of families they would never see again, the small human things that make war personal rather than statistical. On December 10th, 1941, 12 hours after dawn, patrols launched, Enterprise had drawn first blood in the submarine war that would ultimately strangle Japan's empire. The mathematics had been simple. 1 carrier, 1 squadron of dive bombers, 1 damaged submarine. The implications were infinite. American forces could hunt, could kill, could win. The industrial logic that seemed irrelevant to warrior cultures would prove to be the only logic that mattered, and the submarine war, begun in those cold Pacific waters, 200 miles northeast of Oahu, would not end until one side had been destroyed completely. They came as hunters. They died as lessons. The ocean remembers everything.